It's always a joy for me to come here. Sherry and I have such a deep love for this church, and we have a lot of people here that we greatly love. There are a lot of new faces here. I'm glad to hear that and see that, but man, it is awesome. I also love all the changes you've made. I know it's been a while, some of these changes. One thing that's not changed since I was here last, you have to get here early to get a seat at the back. Every time, without a shadow of a doubt. Man, I saw Bibles all over pews early in the service, so I don't know why that is. The church is the only place you try to get as far away from the stage as you can. Anyway, I'm just kidding. It's a joy for me to be here, and I told Bo I take very seriously filling in for him when he's not here. He's such a dear friend, and I love he and his family with all of my heart. I don't know if I'm the only one in the room that feels this way, but as I have gotten older, I have come to love the Bible more than I did when I was like you guys' age. Like when I was y'all's age, it's like, I got to read that, and it didn't really mean much to me. But I want to tell you, as you get older, you listening? It's important. As you get older and you suffer and you have all kinds of stuff happen. John Lennon of the Beatles once said, life's what happens to you when you make other plans. Whatever you have dreamed for your life, I'm telling you, it's going to look very different. That I can tell you. In fact, let me just ask this question. How many of you in here, when you were in high school, thought life was going to look one way, and then you began to live, and it looks very different? I want y'all to turn around and just look. Can I see your hand? Are you watching? I mean, it's unbelievable. So it's great to have plans, but just know it's going to look very different. And so the Word of God means more to me today. I'll tell you one book that really speaks to me in ways that didn't used to speak to me are the Psalms. I don't know if you know this or not, but the Psalms are simply the songs of the afflicted. As we do get older and as we do begin to suffer, as we do begin to have life happen, you really appreciate those who experienced that a long time ago. I came across a psalm, and you don't need to turn there because it's not where we're going to camp out today, but I want to share just a few verses with you earlier this year, and it started me on a journey. And God began showing me things that I really needed to deal with, things in my life that I did not even know were there. And I don't know if this will be what will happen for you today, but I do know that I saw something in Psalm 96. It started me thinking about things I'd never thought of before. The psalmist says this. He says, sing to the Lord a new song. Sing to the Lord, all the earth. Sing to the Lord and bless His holy name. Tell of His salvation from day to day. Declare His glory to the nations, His marvelous works among all the people. For great is the Lord and greatly to be praised. Now, I want to ask you two questions. I want you to keep those going through your mind the entire time we're looking at this passage. And then I want to circle back around and let's answer them together at the end. Okay? So here's the first question. Who do you think that psalm was written for? That's the first question. Be real careful how you answer. Who was that psalm written for? Second one is, who was that song sung to? Ladies and gentlemen, there is a huge battle going on in our churches today. I probably am in 30 to 35 churches a year. I hear guys all over the country say the same thing, that there's a battle going on in our churches. Now, there's not a body count, and there's not blood everywhere, and it's not that kind of a battle, but it's a very, very real battle. It's an incredibly important battle. And the battle has to do with how the church processes life. How many of you believe that two people can see the same thing and not see the same thing? Can I see your hand? Yeah, all of us do. One of us sees something, we get it, the other one sees it, and we don't. And the battle going on in the church today is that there are many of us who see ourselves, we see the world, and we see God very, very differently. And I believe we see these things through two different sets of lenses because there are two mindsets that make up any given church. I guarantee you that your church is no exception. There are two different mindsets that are very, very prevalent in this church, and I want us to look at them. The first one is what I call the secular mindset. The secular thinker always begins all of their conversations with the thoughts and the desires and the expectations of man. In other words, any conversation you have with them always starts with humanity as the starting point. Now, it doesn't mean that they don't have thoughts of God. It just means that often those thoughts of God are extremely perverted, or they are extremely twisted. Why? Because we begin with us as the starting point. Now, you may hear a secular thinker say, God bless America. Remember, God is a part of their vocabulary often. But you will seldom, if ever, hear a secularist say, America must be a blessing to God. How many of you have ever seen God bless America bumper sticker? Can I see your hand? How many of you have ever seen a bumper sticker that says, America bless God? I've only seen one in my lifetime. And it's because we begin all conversations with us. And so what does that produce today? And I hear this over and over and over and over again with young pastors all over this country with a statement like this. That mindset has produced churches that are filled with consumer Christians. Filled. In other words, people who are focused on what they like, what they want, what they desire, more than the desires and the expectations of God. I hear this all of the time. So many people go to church because they want to be entertained. They leave a church because that church did not entertain me, or I think I would enjoy this church better. Do you understand that the purpose of coming today was not your entertainment and not really for your enjoyment, as much as it was to be equipped for the work of the ministry that God's called all of us to? It's very, very important to understand that. And the reason why this mindset is so prevalent is because it's the mindset we were born with. You and I were born to consume. Did you realize that? Do you know by the time a child is 3 years of age, they're already able to differentiate between brands? We are born consumers. And even though most of us in this room are born again, it doesn't mean that that nasty mindset is not going to raise its head from time to time. But the biblical mindset, which is the second mindset that I want to look at, is very different. Because it doesn't begin with the thoughts and the rights and the expectations of man. It begins with the rights and the thoughts and the expectations of God. You see, ladies and gentlemen, one of the core values of any given church has got to be that it thinks biblically. Now, you would assume that is a given, but I'm telling you it's not. I could give you the name after church after church after church after church that thinks more culturally than they do biblically. In other words, it's the culture. And let me tell you something, and to you guys out here in high school, you see the world very differently than your parents do. There's things that you accept that your parents don't accept. We're living in a time today where what used to be celebrated is now condemned. What used to be condemned is now celebrated, and people who don't celebrate are condemned. That's the world we're living in. But when a church begins to think culturally, then a church will continually change. See, ladies and gentlemen, the methodology of our churches has to change. But the message of the church must never change. Because our God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. God doesn't change. Things that God hated thousands of years ago, He still hates today, regardless of what our culture says. And if a church does not understand that, then it simply, at some point in time, falls into idolatry. So I want you to understand that the secular thinker begins with man, the biblical thinker begins with God. So let me show you how it flushes itself out in the church. Take quiet time. I'm hoping that each and every one of you set a time aside every day just to be with God, just to breathe from the pages of His Word, just to sit at His feet. But the secular thinker and the biblical thinker see quiet times very differently. The secular thinker always begins the quiet time with, am I getting out of this what I deserve to be getting? Is this blessing me? This is all about me. But the biblical thinker says, no, my quiet time is about Him. When you sit and have time with God, how often do you sit in silence and not ask God for anything? Just simply think about His existence. Ponder His existence. Think about His existence before all the galaxies were created. Why is that an important exercise? Because the way you and I view God is the way that you and I will worship God. That leads me to the second one. The secular worshiper always sees worship very different than the biblical worshiper. Because the secular thinker always asks after every worship song, did that song bless me? Does that song resonate with my heart? Was that song an enjoyment to me? But the biblical thinker only has one question. Did the words that came out of my mouth, were they a representation of the worth that I attribute to God? You understand that's what the word worship means? It means worthship. Now, I was facing this way today. I didn't turn around and look at everybody worshiping, but there may have been some of you who didn't sing, some of you who kind of sang half-heartedly. What is your name down here with the orange sweater on? Laura. The only one I saw today was Laura was really into worship. I mean, she was into worship. I mean, I got excited about worship just watching Laura worship. But we all approached worship very differently. I don't have to ask Laura if Laura gives worth to God. I saw it by her worship. So you and I this morning, whether you know it or not, by your worship or lack of it, demonstrated the worth that you attribute to God. And the biblical worshiper never asks the question, is this music a blessing to me? Do I like this? All they want to know is my worship pleasing to Him? It's not about what I like as much as it's about what He likes. So they see quiet times different, they see worship different, but they also see the world differently. If you were to ask a secularist, what are the greatest problems in the world? They're going to give you a multitude of answers. They're going to say poverty, social injustice, racial inequality, human suffering. Now, I'm not saying, ladies and gentlemen, that those are not problems in our world, but they certainly are not the greatest problems in the world today. And a biblical thinker will tell you something totally different, because they won't begin with the problems of man. They will begin with the problems of God. And you ask yourself the question, does God have problems? Yes. And each of us in this room helped to create those problems for Him. Which meant God had to do something that only God can do to remedy our problem. And that's where the cross comes in. Now, this may be very shocking to you. I believe some of you will be shocked that the secular thinker and the biblical thinker see the cross very different. Turn with me, if you will, this morning to the 3rd chapter of the book of Romans. I just want to look at one verse this morning and then attempt to answer 2 questions. Romans chapter 3, verse 25. Paul said that God put Christ forward as a propitiation. The word propitiation means a sacrifice that turns away the wrath of God. So let's insert that phrase. God put Christ forward as a sacrifice that turned away God's wrath by His blood to be received by faith. This was to show His righteousness, because in His patience, He passed over many former sins. Now, there are 2 questions this morning that I want us to try to answer. And we've got to get this right, because I'm telling you right now, we don't all have this right. But we've got to get this right, because if we're off center here, we're going to be way off center in other areas of the church. So here's the first question. What is the main problem that the cross solved? Question number 1, what is the main problem that the cross solved? Are you thinking of an answer? Don't give it, but are you thinking? What's the main problem the cross solved? The secular thinker will say that the main problem that the cross solved was to save me from my sins. Why do they say that? Because the secular thinker always begins with man, always begins with humanity. But the biblical thinker, which Paul was, stated, don't miss this, that the primary reason Jesus died was as a demonstration of the righteousness of God. Ladies and gentlemen, whether you know it or not, God's righteousness needs to be seen today. God's righteousness needs to be vindicated. Man desperately needs a glimpse of the glory of God. You ask me today, what does humanity need above everything else? I will tell you that they would catch a glimpse of the glory of God. See, God reveals himself in several ways. Through general revelation, that's bushes and bunnies and blue skies, creation. He also reveals himself through specific revelation, which is his word, but he also reveals himself through us. He reveals himself through us. Those are the ways that God reveals himself. And when the world looks at us, my question is, what kind of God does this world see? You see, I believe our sin, our rebellion has clouded and perverted the glory of God from easily being seen in our lives. Whether you know this or not, when you and I were redeemed, if we were redeemed, that we were redeemed for the purpose of radiating and reflecting the glory of God to the world. We've forgotten that. In fact, how many of you in here remember actually 20 years ago when you took a picture with an actual camera? Does anyone in here remember? Have you guys down here ever taken a picture with anything other than your cell phone? You have? Okay, all right. Has it been a while? Hadn't? See, I don't even know where my camera is. I don't even know where my camera is. I can't even tell you where it is. But I remember a long time ago, I would take my camera and I would look at these beautiful objects. Paul said to Timothy in 2 Timothy 3, he said, Timothy, in the latter days, men and women will become lovers of themselves. In fact, if he were writing that in 2019, I wonder if he would say, Timothy, in the latter days, men and women will be lovers of selfies. You see, remember, we would take the picture with the camera, beautiful mountain range, sunset, beautiful bird, and I can remember back then sometimes finding myself worshiping, glorying in that picture as opposed to the God who made that thing that I just took a picture of. Do you understand what I'm saying? You ever found yourself worshiping a picture of something, the beauty of something, and forgetting all about the God that made it? It's one of the results of the fall in Romans chapter 1. Paul said, because of man's rebellion, one of the consequences of the fall is that humanity would begin to worship creation over Creator. And there's not one single person in this room, starting with me, that has not done that on multiple occasions. We all have. Then all of a sudden, here came the selfie age. And no longer when we take a picture, do we take a picture of a beautiful whatever. Now, my face has to be in the middle of the picture. I don't know if you guys know this or not, selfies can be dangerous. I was reading more than 43 people have died taking selfies since 2011. What? Yes. Like some guy's at the edge of a cliff and someone says, oh, you should step back another step. And he goes, and he falls. There was a kid, he was in the woods, and he saw this bear, and he thought the bear was asleep. And so he walked over there to take a picture of himself with the bear. The bear woke up and mauled the kid to death. They're dangerous. But let me tell you something, folks. That's not the greatest danger. The greatest danger is that potentially now I have to have my face between whatever I'm taking a picture of. I've just potentially placed another potential idol between myself and God. A lady sent a picture the other day on her cell phone, and we're friends on Facebook. It was a picture of her feet with bunions. And she wanted the world to see her bunions. And I'm thinking to myself, who cares? Who led that lady to believe that anyone cares about her bunions or the Mexican food enchilada plate that you ate the night before? No one cares. We are living in the most narcissistic generation that has existed since I've been around. The iPhone, the iPad, the whatever has told us that we are the center of the universe. And though we may be a very narcissistic people, we also are very lonely people. We may have hundreds of followers, but why do most teenagers feel so lonely? Why? Because we've made something other than God the central part of our life. You see, listen to me. Please listen to me. life is not about you making much of yourself. If that's your life, you're going to grow up and die a miserable old man or woman. Life and the blessings of life are about your life making much of your Creator. I'm just telling you, it's the truth. That's why Paul said, and it's very important we don't look over it, that the reason Jesus primarily became our propitiation, look what he says, was to show the righteousness of his dad. Now, was the cross for our sake? Yes. Do not leave here and say, Warren said that the cross was not for our sake. That is not what I said. But before the cross was for your sake and my sake, it was for your Father's sake. Did Jesus lay down his life for us? Yes. But he first laid down his life for his daddy and the proclamation of his daddy's righteousness, which leads to the second question. Here's the second question. Why did that problem need to be solved at the cross? I want you to look at verse 25. The end of verse 25. Here's why this problem needed to be solved at the cross. Because Paul said, God passed over many former sins. It's the passing over of sins that has brought the righteousness of God into question, and it cost God the dearest price to remedy it. All right, let me give you this illustration, and I think this will make it absolutely crystal clear. And if you don't get it afterwards, come see me, but I think it will totally resonate with you. How many of you remember King David, the stories of King David, and how David one day is at home and he opens the window and he sees this great looking gal taking a bath, and he goes, you know what, I want to have sex with her. So he goes and gets his aide and says, bring that woman to me, I want to sleep with her, I'm the king, I get to do what I want. Well, a short time later the woman comes to him and says, I got to tell you something, we got a problem, I am pregnant. Well, there's another problem added to that is the fact that that woman's husband is off fighting one of David's wars. No way was he able to impregnate her. So David says, well, I'm going to put him on the front lines and have him killed. And that was David. And Nathan comes to David in 2 Samuel 12, and he said, David, why have you despised God? How many of you, when you sin, think about that sin, despising God? Ladies and gentlemen, first and foremost, you've got to hear this. Sin is a glory issue. I can just imagine David thinking, despise God? How in the world did I despise God? All I did was have sex with a beautiful woman. I wasn't even thinking about God. How can I despise a God I'm not even thinking about? Then Nathan goes on. And he said, David, the Lord has put away your sins and you're not going to die. Now, I want you to imagine this morning that you're in a courtroom. And David is sitting up here with his defending attorneys, and there's a prosecuting attorney over here, and God is sitting here on a throne. He's the judge. The prosecuting attorney, they give all of their evidence. Then the defending attorneys, they try to defend David, but everybody in that courtroom 100% knows David's guilty. You don't need forensic files. You don't need a bottle of luminol. There's absolutely no doubt whatsoever David committed that treason. He was an adulterer. He was a murderer. Absolutely no doubt. Now it's time for the verdict. And I want you to imagine you're a family member. Your sister is Bathsheba. Or your son, or you're the mother or the daughter of Uriah who was murdered. So here's what God said. David, you're guilty. Everybody in the room knows you're guilty. Whole world knows you're guilty. But son, I'm going to pass over this. And you're not going to get what you deserve. Are you telling me that you are not screaming at the top of your lungs, that is not right? How dare you, God? You call yourself a righteous God, and you act as though David did nothing. You just passed right over that. You can't do that. But he did. And he not only did it for David, but he did it for thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of other people in the Old Testament. That's why this sheds great light on why God, passing over former sins, has brought his righteousness into question. And the way that the Father chose to vindicate his Son and to redeem his righteousness, to vindicate himself, was by the death of his Son. God could have chosen another method. God could have said every little baby that's born and lives, when they die, they're going straight to hell. God would have been perfectly justified. Do you hear me? God would have been perfectly justified to have sent every human being to hell for their treason against him. But that's not how God chose to vindicate himself. He chose to vindicate himself through the death of his Son. Does God love us? Wow. God loves us so. He loves us so. But I don't want you to miss this. His love for us rests in a deeper passion for his glory to be known. So I want you to look at that. Let's look at the next slide. It is the vindication of God's righteousness that is the ground for our salvation. And it is the exaltation of God's glory and righteousness that must be the goal of our salvation. Do you hear me? God's vindication is the ground for our righteousness. His exaltation is the goal of our righteousness, of our salvation. So in other words, exaltation of God has got to be the sole focus of worship. I've given my life, most of it, to missions. And I'd even tell you as a missionary that missions is not the greatest endeavor of the church. It's worship. And the reason for it is simply this. Man is not ultimate. God is ultimate. There's coming a day that missions is going to cease, but worship is going to continue forever. That's why we must get this right. Describing worth to him, exalting him, has got to be the sole focus of our worship of him. I've actually seen churches split over musical preference and style. And so I'm going back to the question that I asked you at the very beginning. Who was Psalm 96 written for? God, or for the people who sang it? Who was the song to be sung to? God, or the people who would sing it? So there's three quick questions I want to ask. I'm going to sit down. Here they are, real quick, without a lot of explanation. Number one, when I worship, do the songs that I sing help me to think of God biblically? Folks, let me just tell you this right now. There's a lot of stuff under Christian music that is absolutely narcissistic and very man-focused, and it may make you feel good, but it does not pursue and proclaim the righteousness of God that we attempted to destroy. Does it help me to think of God biblically? Does the song lead me to pursue and proclaim the righteousness of God that my sins damage? Number two, does the music that I sing help me to contemplate the infinite worth of God? Does it cause me to treasure God or to treasure me and what I like? Number three, have I made a selfie out of my worship? In other words, is it my sinful desires that fill up my worship, or is it the glory of God? You see, selfie-style worship always prefers, don't miss this, sentiment over substance. In other words, the first thing that a secular thinker says when they're singing, did I like that? Did that bless me? Did I really enjoy that? They do. They prefer preference over meaningful proclamation. You know, it is possible, ladies and gentlemen, to make an idol out of our preference. Did you know that? When my preference becomes more important than the proclamation of the glory of God, then I have simply made an idol out of that. How many of you know the day of the week that is the most difficult for worship leaders? Somebody just give me one day of the week you think is the toughest day of the week for them. Somebody just throw out a name. Day of the week. Friday. What day? Friday? I said Friday. Okay, anybody have a different day of the week? When? Okay, Monday. Sunday. Actually, the answer is Monday. And I want to tell you why. Because Monday is usually the day that they get nasty emails or texts or phone calls or personal visits telling them that they did not like the music selection from the day before. It causes unbelievable, and I have talked to so many ministers of music that would affirm that. I have a friend of mine, he said a guy walks in my office on a Monday morning and he sits down, he said, hey, I want to ask you a question. When you were putting together the music selection for yesterday, did you give any thought to me whatsoever? I'm not kidding, folks. It absolutely is the truth. That man was not kidding. Were you thinking of me when you made that music selection? My friend goes, no. And guess what? I never will. Do you really want your music minister thinking about what you like as opposed to what God likes? Do you really want him worrying that he didn't pick songs that you like to sing versus songs that cause the audience to proclaim and pursue the righteousness of God that we damage? How many of you realize that if all of a sudden next week the church just totally changed its selection, and all of a sudden you didn't like it, do you realize there's 6 other days in the week, 23 other hours in the day to sing music that blesses you? Hello? It's not about us coming together and joining the singing things that we like. It's about making certain that what is coming out of our mouth is truly a great description of the worship that I offer God. Where'd Matt go? Where's Matt? There, where? Okay. So I'm going to ask Matt a question. Don't worry, he's got this. He did it the last service. So Matt, in all of your years as a music leader, have you ever had someone critical of your music? Now, before you answer, I know it wasn't here. It was some other church, but you have to think back. I realize that. But do you ever remember a time in your life that someone was critical of your music selection?
Yes.
Okay. Did you hear the yes? Now, I know that's shocking to you, but yes, he's had that happen. So here's the second question. Was the criticism over personal preference, or was it that that individual did not feel like you gave God the glory that he deserved?
Personal preference.
I would pray for him for one thing. Not that he sings stuff I like, but that his heart is pure and he is leading us to pursue and to proclaim a God whose righteousness we damaged. That's what he better be taking care of, because if he doesn't, he's worried about what you think. He's made you an idol in his life. See, folks, we've got to get this right. The church has got to get this right. His vindication has got to lead us to his exaltation, because it is one of the only ways that the church will ever catch a glimpse of the true glory of our God. Would you bow your heads with me, please?